All right. So why don't we get started just by thinking about the subject matter here, right, which is scientific authority. So why don't you start us off by giving us a kind of first pass sense of the claims that science makes for itself, right? So when we talk about scientific authority, how would we begin to get a sense of what's at issue?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I would say that it's a largely debated and discussed question within the history of science, within science studies, which are fields that I kind of intersect with quite a lot. And for the purposes of just keeping the conversation kind of focused, I'll maybe answer it by saying what I'm imagining scientific authority, at least in the context of this essay, to consist largely of. I think that there's a way that, and I think this is what I sort of start the essay by looking at Paul Feyerabend so closely. There's something about the way that scientific authority works that I think we tend to think that scientific authority works because there's something about the sciences by which they have this unadulterated access to the truth. And that as a consequence of this unadulterated access, I very rationally and very willfully decide that I'm going to obey or to be in the truth or to do what I'm supposed to do with respect to the truth. And one of the things that I was sort of thinking about through this essay, and I'm sort of still thinking about it, is that perhaps the question of scientific truth has a lot less to do with what truth claims say, and a lot more to do with how certain discourses get us to act and to get us to the way in which our sort of behaviors are shaped. And so there's a thing I say in the essay about ultimately scientific authority is not about what science says, but about what we do as a consequence of what science says. And so it's something related to our obedience. It's something related to our compliance. This isn't a negative thing, right? This is simply it's an attempt to be kind of neutral description that really the question of scientific authority and its contestation is about the ways certain behaviors, whether they're sort of seen as correct or incorrect. So whether one gets vaccinated, whether one wears a mask or something along these lines. Maybe I'll stop there and you probably have more to ask.
No, of course. So would it be right to say that we're thinking about science not exclusively as a set of claims or theoretical apparatus or actually not as a theory full stop, but as something like a cultural practice or something like, I'm trying not to just get immediately into the Foucauldian vocabulary here.
Right. Well, it doesn't have to be Foucauldian because it's like, it's a very science studies oriented way of thinking. There's the famous Andrew Pickering book called, I'm looking at it right now, Science as Practice and Culture. And so there is something, I do very much think that it's maybe more helpful to think about the efficacy of science, the way it has effects in the world, as less strictly epistemic and more something that's related to our practices, to our procedures, to sort of normative understandings. And let me say one thing too, that I come from the human sciences and the history and the philosophy of the human sciences. And one of the things, the ways that questions around the nature of science, the sort of truth of science and so on and so forth, historically within the field of history and philosophy of science has often emanated out of the physical sciences, where questions around, is this right or is this wrong, or how do we contest this, seem to be a little bit clearer. But in a field like psychiatry, which is something I'm, I guess, technically now an expert in, the question of what counts as the right way to be mentally ill is a harder way of, right? So there's right and wrong with respect to a kind of physical a proposition with respect to the physical world. But when you get into the human sciences, you get into a kind of blurry territory. And it actually seems to me that that's the more interesting way to think about scientific knowledge and its effects on us, if that makes sense.
No, that absolutely makes sense. I think one upshot of this way of looking at things is that you draw this intimate link between two types of authority that science claims for itself. What you might think of as the more ordinary epistemic kind, roughly of the sort, science is the road to getting things right. Science is the road to forming right beliefs. And let's say a moral, you say administrative and moral, but I'm bundling them both as kind of practical,
Right.
So there's there's something, so on Europe, you're kind of interested, I think, in the interplay of both of these types of authority.
Yes,
right?
very much so. Yeah.
And I mean, so one way of reading like your position here is this kind of like, you're kind of critiquing a certain kind of false consciousness. You don't use that language, I think, very advisedly. But
Right.
like, one way of reading you here is to say something like, well, the problem with contemporary scientific authority, and here I'm deliberately putting words in your mouth, the problem with the contemporary notion of scientific authority is that, you know, as a practice, it claims for itself a certain kind of moral neutrality, that, you know, it sort of denies its status as a practice in some way. It says, listen, science is just a way of getting things right. But it kind of, you know, it ignores the fact that it's a sort of heavily politically embedded kind of practice. So
Absolutely.
reading you, does that sound right?
No, I think that's quite right. And to sort of give it a little bit of flesh too, when you claim that science has this, let's say, unembedded, non-contextual access to the truth, you can look at certain forms of, let's say, contestations of scientific authority, anti-vaxxing, whatever it might be, and you simply look and you say, that's error, right? That's irrationality, that's sort of stupidity. And you have a hard time actually being able to make sense of these practices as very much expressions of, let's just say in America, the American social logic. And one of the things I talk about in this essay, one of the things I talk about in the book that's developing from the essay, is the extent to which, at least in the United States in the past 50 years, access to scientific knowledge is often mediated through the marketplace, right? The access to science, medically, technologically, these are things that we purchase. They're heavily commercialized and commodified. And when you understand that science seems to operate in deeply commercialized ways, which is not an idea that I'm by any means the author of, this means a lot of work on this, Phil Murawski most especially, what you begin to see is that in a certain way, certain expressions of anti-science actually mimic the commercialization of science, so that people are saying no to science in the same way that they may say no to a particular product. So we say yes and no to science in ways that can be made sense of through a kind of economic reasoning. And you only begin to see this sort of symmetry between these two forms of behavior when you fundamentally embed scientific authority and everyday kind of practices, rather than as this sort of transcendental kind of possibility in which either a person is correct or incorrect. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I mean, just to make a philosophical distinction here, that so one way of hearing you is as a kind of a way we sort of philosophers of science of a sort of realist bent can hear sociological claims, dissolving truth into something practical. Right. But I take it, you know, that's to read you in a sort of overly rationalistic kind of way, that what you're not saying, I mean, in fact, you're not making any sort of commitment about the nature of, you know, scientific truth. You're sort of not engaging in the sort of realist, anti-realist debates.
Right, right.
I took the critique to be something more like, the problem with like the idea of scientific truth is that it kind of hides its own social embed. It kind of prevents us from making sense of its own kind of political, its connection. Maybe, you know, the claim is not that it's reducible to this kind of market mechanism or anything like that, or, you know, but rather that there's something about contemporary scientific authority that sort of hides this sort of social reality that we're trying to get access to.
And precisely that concealment is what leads to all these problems, these contestations around truth behavior, and then these presumptions. It's like, you know, I've heard interviews with colleagues of mine in public policy who talk about what's the way to get these science deniers on board. And if it's not going to be through some kind of educative protocol, like better science literacy, which, by the way, these people are not illiterate with respect to science, then the other option is just juridical enforcement, fine them, imprison them, that's a terrifying prospect. And I'm not sure, and it seems to me that the answer to a certain form of resistance is not to impose more force and then assume that they will obey. So it's a misunderstanding of the problem itself. And this gets as well to the idea that and I'll just say this, that there's an assumption that scientific or denials and skepticisms and oppositions to scientific authority is irrational, but then scientific adherence is completely rational and makes a lot of sense, even though a lot of those behaviors are also, in some respects, habituated, routinized, thoughtless in some respects. I trust doctors, but I'm not sure if I have a good reason why I do, outside of the fact that my parents taught me to trust doctors, and it's just something I just do. In that sense, it too is a socially embedded practice, and we lose a lot. We lose a lot of analytic detail if we overlook this important, let's say, attribute, right, of how science works.
Right. I mean, you're making that point sociologically, because I can hear people saying, like, well, there's the germ theory of disease, there's there's a body of medical science. You're not making that claim in the sense of there is no justificatory story to be told.
Right.
Right. The claim is rather that this is how scientific practice functions.
That's right. And this is the same distinction that someone like Paul Feyerabend makes, where he says, consistently accused of being anti-science, but he wasn't anti-science. He was trying to differentiate what it means to produce scientific knowledge and then what it means to distribute that knowledge as a form of governance in the world. And that there's an important way that one has to separate these two things. This is a kind of paradox that's often been pointed out, and Feyerabend does it very explicitly, and you see it in a lot of other places. There's a presumption, of course, that something like scientific truth is an inherently democratic concept. And the relationship between democracy and truth is longstanding in the modern era. The historian, Sophie Rosenfeld has talked about this. I mean, a lot of people have talked about this. But the paradox that Feyerabend points out is that what's interesting, and again, he's not the only one, the presumption of truth's sort of democratic nature is the fact that it's universal and that presumably everybody has access to it. At the same time, though, and here's where the paradox comes in, not everybody has access to it in the sense of the access to produce it and to talk about it in authoritative ways. So it's actually very bounded, very separated, very, let's say, hierarchical kind of structure. And so it sort of presumes democracy and is not democratic because the idea of us all voting on a scientific principle is radically anathema to the way science works. And this is simply the kind of contradiction, if you like, that Feyerabend wants to point out and to say, we need to realize that this is the case if we actually want to, let's say, counter certain forms of nefarious practices. Like, after all, it's important for there to be vaccines. It's important for there to be, this is not good if millions of people are dying from a pandemic that these sort of senseless deaths are not. But the way to resolve it by saying you're stupid or you're immoral or by enforcing it is going to do nothing. It's not going to do anything at all. Right.
No, one way I think of undertaking this sort of gestalt shift that you're urging on us is to think of is to realize we're kind of wrong about what scientific discourse is, that it's not to be understood on the model of kind of 20th century philosophy of science. I mean, not that this is the only way of doing this, but as a sort of set of propositions which make purely epistemic claims, that it's actually a discourse of governance. It's a way that we form ourselves as subjects, the way we think about how to be and how to exercise power and authority over each other, that claims that seem to be claims which are purely scientific very quickly wade extremely deeply into sort of political waters and authoritarian waters. So your colleagues comment about how we ought to relate to science deniers and so on. But there's this kind of there's this kind of, the scales have to fall from our eyes in terms of this idea that contemporary science discourse is not best understood as theoretical, but rather as kind of sort of political discourse from the ground up in a certain way.
I think that's definitely one way. I would put it another way as well, but this is just, it sort of parallels the point that you're saying, which I completely agree with and think is right. There's a tendency, it's not simply about thinking about scientific truth in a not strictly in a kind of propositional way, or kind of getting out of a realist, anti-realist kind of argument, which I think leads us kind of nowhere, and embedding it in practices. Another way of thinking about this sort of, as it were, a gestalt shift, is to say that one of the ways that truth and scientific truth operates for us in many places. So yes, in the context of scientific knowledge production, but also I would say even in the university broadly, is that it tends to take on a very specific model, which I would say is juridical. So that when one is either in truth, and in that sense you are law abiding, or you are out of truth, in which case you have engaged in some kind of epistemic penalty, right? To be in error is a form of like transgression or something like this. And so there's something deeply almost belligerent about truth, that to be outside of it is not just error, right? But it's some kind of profound, it's not just a kind of blunder, but it's a kind of profound transgression. And there's something, it seems to me, that it's related, of course, to the question of governance and how truth does operate in governance, but that it governs in a very specific way, and in a way that almost guarantees resistance, right? Because there's a way that, in the modern era, like it or not, and here we can be kind of Foucauldian, is that the modern ways of being governed is either to obey or to resist. I mean, you see that dichotomy in Kant's What is Enlightenment? Argue as much as you want, but obey. So there's sort of the duality of certain forms of the right way to resist and the right way to obey is a preoccupation of Enlightenment thought. But when truth operates as a kind of cudgel, which I think it does, particularly, and this is what motivated me with respect to the essay in the first place, and continues to do so with respect to the book, that this deep kind of moralizing of anti-vaxxers, that they're dangerous people and they should be in prison, which is kind of exactly the sort of discourse that we hear from the Trump. It's like, I should be in prison too, right? And so I'm not sure that's doing anything. So that truth understood, if we're talking about a gestalt shift, what would it mean to imagine truth not in juridical terms? Or is it only possible to be thought in these ways? But I don't think so, right? Because there's a way that even a pre-modern history of truth, let's say, for example, in deeply religious context, is not about the juridical being in the truth in the right ways or else being penalized. It has something, I don't know, religious truth or some kind of ecstatic state or some kind of bearing witness state. I'm not suggesting that we invoke it. I'm simply invoking that to show how transient the concept and transformative the concept can be, and maybe why people are constantly not in the truth in the right ways. The reason for this is because we keep formulating truth in such harshly juridical ways. Is that clear? I don't know if that's
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I wanted to bring out an element of this kind of juridical idea. This notion of trust plays a very important role in the story that you tell. And I was wondering if that might shed some light on what this kind of moral character of anti-science is that we're talking about. So one thought might be, well, what's wrong with the vaccine skeptic, for example, is that, they trust the wrong people. I mean, that's slightly flippant, but I take it that this notion of trust is sort of highly morally charged, right? That, sort of who you trust is supposed to have deep implications for what kind of person you are, and thus the ways in which you can be blamed.
Yeah. Yes. The way I frame it in the essay, and I still think it's sort of true, is that the difference between the trust of the science adherent and the trust of the science denier is not the form of trust. It's merely the content of trust. So they're still trusting in the same sorts of ways. And I take trust here. I have a tendency. So there's actually, you know this better than I do, because I'm sort of a visitor to these books, but there's a lot of, I think I assume it's something between moral philosophy and philosophy of science. There's work on the concept of trust. And there's a way that in these philosophical works, and they're semi-recent because they are kind of responses to sort of the anti-science stuff in the past 10 years, they take a highly rationalist account of what trust is as a form of behavior. And it seems to me, maybe this is a kind of a difference in first principles, where it strikes me that the rationales that we tend to develop with respect to whom we trust, these are actually retroactive things. These are sort of retroactive attributions that I don't trust because of reason, but I trust for other reasons, then I rationalize it after the fact. And so it seems to me that it's not for lack of reason that someone trusts the wrong, trusts YouTube or whatever over a medical practitioner, but that they come to trust for whatever reasons they come to trust, and then rationalize it in the ways that they do. Because there's very excellent work, and I talk about this in the essay, and I talk about this in the book. In the context of communities that have been subjugated to the violence, the sort of intersection of violence of medical practice and governance, Black communities, Indigenous communities, immigrant communities, their distrust, as it were, of the state is profoundly rational. It would be weird to trust, actually, in their cases. I don't want to go too far off the track here, but it seems to me that we miss a lot when we think about trust in epistemic terms. So a lot of what I am, in fact, trying to do is to say a lot of these categories that we consider to be like purely epistemic would be best understood as, let's say, moral, administrative, affective expressions of conduct rather than expressions of reason. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the notion of trust struck me as kind of very similar to the idea of giving one's consent to a sovereign, and kind of similar to the sort of political discourse about, say, it's very prominent in the social contract tradition, right? That,
Right.
There's a distinctive type of commitment that you undertake when you sort of subject yourself to the authority of the sovereign, and thus become a member of like a relevant political regime.
Right.
And by implication, subject yourself to a set of laws, become a juridical subject.
Right.
And
Right.
I take it the resemblance is not incidental, that, we're thinking here of science very much, scientific authority, very much as a membership in sort of scientific community, very much as a kind of polity.
I think that's quite right. And one thing I would add too is that the consent, what's interesting is, and this is the case in a lot of work, that the consent is not always just a rational expression. That in some respects, what you say is, I have already been consented to. Like somehow I have been put into a vector of consent, and then I find myself either agreeing or disagreeing with the consent that's already been asked of me. I think, does that make sense? And so sort of divorcing it from some kind of agential behavior. And I think that there's a way, and in fact, there's this quote that I have from Spinoza, because of course there's an entirely different trajectory where you have like rational consent, sort of social contract theories, and then this account, and I quoted in the essay, and I'm going to read it, and I can't believe I'm not reading myself. This is actually a Spinoza quote. I wish I could share a screen, but it's not on my screen here. He says, a person's judgment may be subjected to another's, and he's talking about sovereign control, in many different and sometimes almost unbelievable ways, to such an extent that even though he may not be directly under the person's command, he may so be dependent on him that he may properly be said to be under his authority to that extent. So that there are these tacit forms of consenting to structures of authority that are constantly operating. This is actually, it seems to me, and I will be very honest, this is a trajectory that takes us to Foucault, right? This is precisely, in some respects, you could say if there's a hidden genealogy to the concept of power, it's there. It's a kind of Spinoza's line, but we don't need to talk about that too much. But the idea here is that I think you're absolutely right, that consent is a structure, and one consents to a social, a political, to a polity, and also to a scientific polity. Polity isn't the right word, but that I would simply add that the consent is something that may be happening to you rather than something you're doing.
Right. No, and many people would want to say something analogous for the political case as well. That think about your relationship to the country you grew up in. I mean, so this is another way of bringing, I think, making vivid the kind of picture you're suggesting, that we relate to science and scientific discourse in much the same way as we relate, or in similar ways to it, the way we relate to the state where we happen to be part of, the state we've grown up in. I mean, in that case as well, there is a similar conversation about, have you rationally consented to the state, Or is the rational consent story an afterthought, a post hoc rationalization of something that was entered into, it's sort of I suppose there are many differences here, but it's sort of one difference is that in the case of the state, there at least is a vocabulary we have, right, where we can kind of begin to rationally interrogate, like, the notion of legitimacy and so on and so forth. And I think what you're bringing out in the scientific case is there's a similar kind of attachment.
Exactly.
But there isn't a similar kind of critical vocabulary. Like we can't interrogate we can't interrogate science in the same way that we can interrogate sort of state authority.
You can, but you're called a crazy anti-science advocate. See, this is Feyerabend's point, is precisely, he's not saying we should say no to science. He's saying, even if we wanted to, it doesn't seem like we can, because people will say that we're either crazy or immoral. And it's strange because I could sit here and give a talk, like right in this circumstance, and I could offer invective after invective of modern liberal democracy and why people can't flourish under it, about capitalism and its complicity with, I can do all this, but if I were to start talking about how actual scientific doctrines are wrong, I would seem like a madman. And there's something about that which is very, very interesting. And I don't think, certainly Feyerabend didn't think, and many others don't think, that it has something as simple. It's not simply because science has access to truth, and therefore I'm in a state of falsehood. Because of course, any historian of science knows how profoundly plastic and transformative science has been, and how truths come in and out of it. There's something about I've actually seen advocacy, like kind of white papers by people trying to figure out the anti-science problem and offering supplements to the sort of what I call educative hygiene, which is fixing the problem through more science literacy. A lot of some of these papers have said something like, it's not more science that people need, it's more science studies, so that they actually know that science is actually quite flexible, that it's never secure, that it's always done in context. But of course, then the reactions to the idea that we teach everyone about social constructivist theories of science is that it'll actually result in more anti-science, which I don't think any of these things are going to work, right? I don't think any of these are the solutions, but anyway.
No, exactly. So one kind of, I suppose, nitpicky question I had was, when we think about science, the sort of paradigm of science in, let's say in America and UK, sort of the physical sciences and particularly physics, we have a kind of sort of hierarchy of science picture, right? But often the things that get debated in the public sphere don't usually have the kind of generality of physics, and often they're not even sort of pure theory. They're sort of applied public policy style disciplines or medicine or things like that, where the theoretical and the practical, not just, and this is not even like you science studies person saying this, medicine is not a sort of purely predictive discipline. It's like interventionist to its core. So I guess I just found that an interesting kind of observation, that when we talk about the authority that's claimed is that you'd have the quantum physics or the sort of grand unified theory or what have you, but the disciplines we're talking about are often sort of applied sciences or engineering or things of that sort.
Yeah. So no, that's a do you want me to say something about that?
Sure.
Yeah, because I think that's a very important point to make. And it's an important point that's actually been quite significant in the history of a particular tradition that I find very formative, which is the French kind of philosophy of science tradition. This was one of the people that I read very closely, who I think is very important, Georges Canguilhem, makes this very important point, which is the way that the life sciences break from the physical sciences is precisely by identifying this fundamental difference between the organic world and the inorganic world, which is that the world of physics and the world of other kind of natural sciences, they have a mathematizability, a lawfulness that simply does not exist with respect to what you might call the life sciences and eventually the human sciences. And even though we want to suffuse it aspirationally with the belief that ultimately there are laws and principles that will work with respect to how humans behave or how viruses work, that's not the case. And so, in fact, they become quite open, quite vulnerable, you could say, to this sort of politicization, if you like. And this is actually why someone like Foucault was so interested in psychiatry, was so interested in, the sciences of sexuality. It's because they are always more prone to being commandeered for, as an expression of the social logic, in a way that physics, we're not having debates about quantum physics, and even the debates that we're having about AI are not the same debates we're having about vaccines. And they never will be, it seems to me. So that's an important, this is precisely why I make quite clear, at least I don't in the essay, but in the book, I make quite clear, it seems to me that you really have to think about a lot of these questions from a standpoint of the human sciences. There's something that it does that's very different. And the history and philosophy of science is often so dominated by a physical science model.
Yeah, so just to, I suppose, one final question from my side before we move into the Q&A. I was wondering if you could comment on the sort of reform proposal you briefly discussed towards the end of your essay. This Feyerabend sort of utopia of a world where scientists would be, quote, more than balanced by magicians, priests, or astrologers. I guess maybe to sort of spice that question up a bit is sort of addressing the question of reform by sort of thinking about the relationship between contemporary science and sort of liberal capitalism, which we've gestured at, but haven't spoken
right
about.
Okay, that's a great question and a very hard question, and only one I can sort of gesture at. I don't necessarily think that Feyerabend has the answer, although it does strike me that there is something worth considering in his proposal. And I don't talk about it in the essay, but it's very present in his work, which is to say that science is merely one form of life among others, and that it should not be perceived as the kind of dominant mechanism of truth making. It has its important values, like we should develop vaccines, we should build bridges, we should do certain things. But to suggest that it is the only form of life and that anything which is not within it is in error is not going to generate the kind of democratic society, this equitable society that we want. And probably actually, he does in fact suggest that if you want more science compliance, you actually get it by having science become merely one form of life among others. My intervention is to say, and this is, it can only be speculative at this moment, what would it mean if dominant conceptions of truth relinquish this commitment to a kind of juridical model, that if you're not in the truth, you're being penalized somehow? What other forms of kind of truth making? Because the thing is, science doesn't work because a bunch of scientists are like, aha, that's the truth. That's not even how scientific practice works, right? An experiment operates in a certain way, and it continues to operate until it no longer operates. So there's a certain way in which the kind of operationalizability of a particular experiment or a particular model or whatever becomes the mechanism by which we say scientific practices are working or they're not working. In a strange way, and Feyerabend says this as well, science itself doesn't need truth. Like it doesn't even need it to work. So it does seem to me that there's a kind of, I don't want to use this word in any technical sense, but a kind of ideological force of truth that suffuses science and it suffuses society. And I think it causes a lot more problems than it needs to. So I don't know, I don't have a utopic solution, but it's more of speculative. What would it mean to kind of reimagine other paradigms?
I mean, before transitioning to it, I think an observation might be helpful here, that often it's useful to look at this notion of scientific authority as kind of the other side of the coin to political phenomena that we haven't talked about that much, but deserve comment, right? So you might think, well, listen, part of the reason that we have the form of scientific discourse that we do is, because, let's say, as liberals, one of the things that's happened in liberal politics is that, we have sort of suffused with ethical skepticism. We're very sort of suspicious of, any sort of thick, value-filled political discourse. and there's a kind of evacuation of the public sphere and public debate, right? And so the one kind of story you might tell, sort of political kind of accompaniment to your scientific story here, is that sort of science is filling a vacuum. Scientific discourse is playing a certain kind of role, possibly, evacuated by a more thick kind of politics. I guess it's.
I actually completely agree. And I would not only say it's filling the vacuum of a thick politics, and I'll just say this final thing, but I also think it's filling the thick vacuum of a kind of public ethos, like a public ethics in an increasingly kind of secularized world. Like after, why does science become this? It seems to me that when, as a sort of religious public ethics recede in the secular West, it has to be filled with something, other modes of adjudicating moral value. And it seems to me that the dominant ones are juridical, economic, and medical. And I actually say a lot about this in the book that's coming out in a couple months. But I won't say anything now, but it does seem to me that I think you're quite right. Science, in terms of its moral valence, fills a certain vacuum. And it didn't need to do this. We can still create vaccines and build rockets and computers without having it to, it's like science is doing too much is the problem here, right? It does the things it does well, it does them well, but it's also taking on too much. It's become overly capacious. And in that sense, I think that's what people resist. You see, that's what the anti-vaxxers resist. The climate deniers are very different. They're just simply making money. But I'm talking about the everyday. That's what they're resisting. It's that excess of science.
Right. So let's go to questions now. So Alice asks a question about the distinction between pseudoscience and anti-science. So Alice says, do people peddling pseudoscience take science more seriously because they at least try to operate within its conventions?
That's a great question. I think that the tricky thing with the term pseudoscience is that it can mean a lot of things. So for instance, like Karl Popper refers to psychoanalysis as a pseudoscience because it doesn't have the strict falsifiability of an experimental scientific program. Although you could say that most medicine doesn't have, like vaccine trials don't have that kind of falsifiability. You can only, in a lot of medicine, you can only really ascertain whether the therapeutic works by virtue of whether the symptoms seem to recede. There's no certainty, right? Even the COVID vaccines were only like 95% effective. So there are instances, it seems to me, where pseudo, and I try and resist like too much like nomenclatural kind of classifications of things, but there are ways that sometimes a pseudoscience functions precisely in order to counter a dominant scientific doctrine. And then there are other instances in which the pseudoscience is it's an invective that doesn't actually quite refer to anything in particular. I like to use the word anti-science because I want to refer or try and think about resistances to scientific authority rather than other forms. But yes, there are many you might call pseudosciences that supposedly could be anti-science in that respect. I don't know if I'm answering the question well, but.
Right. There's a related kind of question. So Andreas asks about what you have to say about scientism. And I guess a spin on this question for me is that I think in some way your point is that what people worry about under the rubric of scientism, you think, given the kind of current public role of science and sort of the good science and the bad scientism kind of flow together. Is it, one way of seeing your point?
Yeah, well, yes. It's funny, I try to be cautious as well about not talking too much about scientism, because it seems to me that in many of the cases of even the strongest forms of science adherence, people are not necessarily being scientistic. Like a scientism would be someone saying, I believe that we should get vaccines. And also, I think biomedicine should be the logic by which we imagine everything else. And that's not the, so I want to be kind of careful about that. I don't want to go too far. Scientism is also a very interesting history, given its kind of complicity within the history of neoliberalism. I don't know if people are kind of aware of this, like Hayek's anti-scientistic kind of positions that a lot of the like Rothbard and Hayek had these. They wrote many essays. I mean, Hayek in particular about why scientism is dangerous,
Right.
and that seems like it accords. I mean, a lot of humanists think scientism is also very dangerous, but the question is, why do we think scientism is dangerous? What is it that we're protecting from the realm of science that we think scientific overreach is a problem? And for Hayek, what's interesting is that he was very cautious about the rules, and essentially he was very cautious about social behaviors being excessively formulated into kind of mathematical or mathematizable models of action. And the reason for him is that there needs to be a kind of inexplicable, ineffable spirit in human action that can produce the spontaneous generations that result in the marketplace and in market innovations. So there has to be a kind of magic in society that's this that essentially befits like neoliberal innovative markets. So he was quite against scientism. So I don't want to also be against scientism, but it seems to me that the question is, what's the danger, as it were, that kind of the overreach of science is. So I actually think science does overreach, but it's not an explanatory overreach, right? It's an administrative overreach. It's an overreach of governance, not an overreach of explanation. So it's a different kind of overreach that maybe I'm interested in thinking about.
But you're sort of open to the thought that at least like some concerns that are expressed under the rubric of scientism kind of overlap with the kinds of worries you're trying to express.
I think so, yes, while also being clear to disambiguate the stakes of the anti-scientistic positions with what I'm saying.
Right. I mean, and you, by bringing up Hayek, I think you bring up the sort of older science discourse that we haven't really spoken about, right? Where there's this kind of intimate connection between science and a kind of left progressive politics. So Murawski talks about this a lot, right? So there's older discourse where, science and socialism are kind of very deeply connected because, it's to use Murawski's own rather colorful way of expressing this, right? That sort of, the market is from Mars and the state is from Venus. Something like that, right? The thought is that, science is the friend of a kind of progressive politics because it sort of makes society more rational.
Right. And it seems to me that I don't think there is any intrinsic political value to a scientific doctrine. Like there's no reason why any science has to be this way or that way, but can be made into this or that way. That's a debatable point, but I'll leave it at that. That there's no intrinsic value to a scientific theorem. Let's say it's what's done with the theorem that gives it its value.
Right. It's that older discourse is tricky because once you bring in kind of sort of Marx and Hegel and things of that sort of the notion is, there are many notions of science kind of proliferate.
I've tried to deal with it by simply not dealing with the Marxist history of the philosophy of science, but that's probably not very helpful. So
so there's a question from Ash here. So besides the moralizing of science, adherence, distrust, what about the aspect of anti-science that points to uncertainty, such as uncertainty in climate models or public health interventions?
Is the question saying the production of uncertainty as a tactic?
Yes, I take it the thought there is that, uncertainty is weaponized as resisting science adherence.
Yeah, again, even that is very interesting. I can think of two historians of science who would say two counterposing things. The first is Noemi Oreskes, whose work on climate science, and she's been very sort of integral in precisely this argument about how climate deniers produce uncertainty, how the tobacco industry produces uncertainty as a form of kind of fomenting distrust. What's interesting, though, is that uncertainty does not, or the production of uncertainty or the fact of uncertainty is not in and of itself a automatically allied with an anti-science position. There's a great book, oh gosh, if I can remember, it's by the historian Deborah Cohen at Yale. It's her first book on Viennese science called, oh gosh, now I can't, for some reason, remember the, give me a second because I don't want to not say it. It's right here in front of me. Okay. Oh, it's Vienna in the age of uncertainty. Okay, science, liberalism, and private life. The point here is that in that case, she's talking about Viennese turn of the century physical sciences and the way that uncertainty functions as a way of connecting, as it were, good democratic liberal politics with scientific knowledge production. So there, uncertainty functions to bring science and democracy together, and for Orestes, it functions to separate them apart. So that's, I'm not really giving an answer so much as saying that there is no one answer there. And I certainly wouldn't look to uncertainty as itself, let's say, distinctly on one side of the discussion or the other.
Right. So Anne asked this question about overreach in terms of sensationalism. So there's much talk of a credibility gap. So Anne talks about, the Benjamin Libet paper, which the neuroscience paper allegedly claimed to have proven there's no free will.
Right.
But presumably we could name lots of kinds of overreach. So I guess how should we think of overreach and sensationalism? Because I'll add that this is often the category that practitioners use to think about your phenomenon. Scientists will often think about the overreach and governance you're talking about by thinking, well, there are those people over there who communicate science badly.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess a couple things maybe come to mind. And the first is that what we always have to remember is that science, on the one hand, is a very humble practice, right? Fernando Vidal is this historian of science who's written on histories of neuroscience and the histories of this sort of equating the brain and the self. And one of the things he says is, just putting the Libet thing aside, the proof of the absence of free will, a great point he says is that, there's actually no single neuroscience paper that has ever definitively proven that mind is brain. And so the entire field of neuroscience is operating under a supposition that it is not proven and could not possibly prove. But at the same time, you might say, is that really kind of necessary does that essentially abnegate all of neuroscientific kind of right? Does that abnegate all of neuroscience? And I don't think it does. I think that ultimately what we have to remember is that science is produced by people. It's a practice. It's a human practice. And so the overreaches they're inevitable, right? I don't think we're going to see them disappearing. And I think it seems to me as well that the part of what makes, if I had to diagnose what makes a lot of the overreach, these excessive kind of claims so prominent, this is a bit maybe excessive, but there is a kind of complicity between money and science, where even just to get funding, a lot of practicing scientists have to make certain kinds of declarations about what they're doing and about what the kind of downstream kind of consequences are. And they can potentially get caught up in certain kinds of rhetorical flourishes that they use very tactically for funding purposes in the actual practice itself. And I don't know what the answer to this is. I think maybe there are other science studies scholars I'm sure there are who have better answers than I do about this, but I think that there's something, I wouldn't consider it a pathology of science, but rather an inevitable fact of science, that there is a certain kind of overreach that does sometimes happen.
Right. So Adelaide has an interesting question about whether anti-science mirrors the non-epistemic kind of juridical character that you're talking about. I think you think it does in a certain way. But is anti-science a replacement? So how reciprocal are the claims that you make for science and anti-science? Is anti-science a twin or a shadow, I think is one way of putting it.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that's also something, that relationship is something I'm developing in the new book project. I would actually say that the relationship, so there's sort of two paradigms I use to think about the relationship. And the first is drawn from the social studies of the SSK, the Strong program, the Edinburgh School, David Bloor, Barry Barnes, the concept of symmetry, which is to say it's a sociological phenomenon that there are no necessarily good reasons for why scientists accept true claims about science versus false ones, and that the rationale ends up becoming whatever is the sort of socially acceptable way of thinking is what becomes true and what becomes false. So in some sense, so that's the first kind of paradigm I would say that maybe not twins, maybe not mirrors, but they're sort of symmetrical. But the thing is, I would say, when Bloor theorizes his concept of symmetry in 81 or 82 or something like this, he's heavily reliant on Wittgenstein and language games and something along these lines that I often have thought that maybe the best way of thinking about it is through this French the French epistemological tradition of the notion of positivity, or what we more popularly know as like an episteme. And what's interesting about the concept of episteme, and a lot of people have written on this, Ian Hacking, Arnold Davidson, is that when episteme defines the right way to be true in a particular historical moment, but it also defines the right way to be false. So that there are forms of proper truths and forms of proper untruths. And anything which is not part of this episteme is neither true nor false, it's just sort of nonsense. And I've begun thinking about anti-science as the right way to be wrong about science adherence or science obedience. It's the right way to be, it's the right way to obey wrongly, if that makes sense. And so twinning, mirroring, yes, perhaps a dialectic, I don't know if that would be the word I would use, but there is a certain, here's what I would say, a deep proximity between these two forms of conduct. I don't think they're antinomies. I think they're actually bound in certain ways.
Well, to put that point in a particular way, so we can think of anti-science as sort of implicitly this is the way that the sort of contemporary regime of scientific authority pictures its opponent or pictures its other.
I think so. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. There's a certain intelligibility to anti-science, right? It's not a chaotic form of behavior. It's not nonsense. These people are not invoking humoral medicine. I mean, even when they are, they're not really doing it because they're invoking it only for the purposes of some kind of commercial end, right? Some kind of market purpose. There's a deep meaningfulness, a deep intelligibility to anti-science. And I think we need to take that seriously.
Right. Joanna asked this question about the moral force of scientific authority becoming especially clear when people use science to defend racist or misogynistic views. So she brings up Charles Murray and the bell curve.
Right.
It's an interesting question about, I guess, what does your account say about these types of cases, and what are we to do if you have any thoughts about those?
So, okay, I think with things like Murray and other forms of racist science, the consensus is not that they're racist science. The consensus is that they are not science. They're just racism. And so in their efforts to, I don't know, I often think, I'm not sure racists need reasons to be racist. They're simply racist. And so these are modalities of reinforcement, but they're not even science, right, is the thing. And so I don't really talk about them in strong detail, because here's the thing, good science still works in a racist way, right? Mortality rates among Black women in reproductive medicine are horrifyingly high. Right? There is no other explanation than the fact that there are these tacit forms of structural racism that operate in what we would not call racist science. So we can look to actual racist science, but I think no one in the scientific community calls that science. They do call obstetric care, gynecological medicine, reproductive medicine, they do call that science, and it still works in a racist way, right? So I think that's where we should be putting our sights. And we can say the same thing about virtually every form of medicine, psychiatry in particular. So does that make sense? That's a kind of distinction I want to draw, is that even the sciences that we don't call racist can operate in racist ways. So there's no need to look at bell curve and all this nonsense. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, in a way, Murray himself is kind of, he's sort of part of this. I think you're right to point out that he doesn't even really, the bell curve has uptake, but it doesn't have uptake in the kind of hegemonic liberal sort of public science discourse that we're talking about.
It has uptake among white supremacists and
conservative intellectuals, whether there's a distinction. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And well, I don't think there is, but I mean, yes, exactly. I agree. So it's an uptake that that's not the concern for me. It's a whole separate, they'll take up anything to justify to themselves what it is they think they're kind of doing. But because regular medicine, despite itself, can operate in such devastating ways, it's worth, I think, thinking about that more, I think it's worth thinking about that more analytically than wasting our time. I mean, I'm not suggesting that it's not important to take these things seriously as threats. We absolutely must, but I don't want to mix them in too much, if that makes sense.
Right, because that sort of stuff doesn't fall into your rubric of this dialectic between science adherence and science rejection, right? So, you might just say something slightly weaker, which is that that's worthy of analysis under another, under some sort of other set of concepts, right? So not the phenomenon.
Yeah.
So we're getting close to the end here. And so we might. So I guess to sort of ask a question of my own, sort of more prospectively, I was wondering about you speak about resistance to scientific authority and anti-science practices, and there are a lot of people, particularly in vaccine discourse, who think of sort of resistance to science. So we think of all these doctors. One of our questioners, Bart, brings up, Jay Bhattacharya, who's become quite famous in vaccine discourse. So a lot of people think of anti-science as a kind of positive political praxis, right? This is certainly very prominent in the US presidential elections, where being anti. They wouldn't brand themselves anti-science, but sort of doing, sort of taking an oppositional stance to big science. Right. It's a kind of there's a sort of positive politics there, right? I guess I was curious about your thoughts about that. It's I guess the political potential of anti-science, if you think there is any.
You mean actually offering positive? Not positive in the value sense, but
because that's how it understands itself, right? It understands itself as a kind of politics of liberation, right? As a and as a resistance movement, and it is resisting sort of something. Again, look, I would say personally, what's motivating this entire project is that I think a lot of these positions are remarkably dangerous. They are in fact dangerous. I do think vaccine hesitancy is dangerous. I think it's I get all the boosters or whatever. I don't think I don't think I'm going to die because of the boosters or whatever. I think the positions are dangerous. I think the efforts to counter them are ineffective because we don't understand them or are unwilling to appreciate what they actually are. And when you ally science and governance, as has happened in the United States, and especially in the 20th century, and especially in the post-war period, you're always going to get forms of resistance because there's a certain way in which the question of modern governance as a person who is governed will always be, do I obey or do I resist? I think this is underlying Feyerabend's position, which is to say, if you make science into one form of life among others, you reduce its dominance in the polity, but that doesn't mean reducing its compliance. He says more people will very likely comply because the question of obey or resist isn't even made relevant with respect to science. So when you make it part of the remit of science, you're always going to split the populace into those who obey and those who resist, because that's the dichotomy you're forcing onto people. And so that's what I would say about the movement is, if you really want it to stop, I don't know what a productive program would be to separate it out, but it seems to me, I will say this, their behaviors make sense. They're dangerous, but they're not irrational. And their rationality is illuminated when you look at the broader context in which scientific governance operates. Right.
A lot of people don't want to hear that, but it's well, what are you going to do? It's make them study more science. That's not helpful. I don't even know how you're going to get that to happen. The only other option is to call out the police on them. And it's really? So now we're allying with the police. That seems like not a very good direction either. So
I mean, I suppose you're rationalizing them in two ways, right? You're saying on the one hand, like, it makes sense that there are these people who are questioning big science because it's sort of, intertwined with politics. But also you're saying that there's something incredibly legitimate, right, about this kind of suspicion that these movements have that they're being sold a bill of goods, right?
It's a certain kind of legitimacy in the sense that, it's like this gets to more interesting conversations, which we obviously don't have time for, about conspiracy theories, which is that, there's some great work. Didier Fasson has a wonderful essay. You can Google Fasson and conspiracy theory. And he says, look, conspiracy theories are always overwrought expressions of a social logic. In other words, they're very legitimate things, but they're sort of just off kilter a little bit. So it is in fact the case that a couple pharmaceutical companies have made a lot of money based on, right, these vaccines, which have saved lives. And so they kind of misread things, but I wouldn't say that their resistance is legitimate. I would say their resistance, if by legitimate we mean that value positive, I'm not suggesting I agree with it, but I'm saying there's a rationality to it. So if you want to say legitimate in a kind of Kantian sense, perhaps we could say that. But I would say it is a deeply intelligible form of behavior, if that makes sense.